BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. On Fridays this year I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history, and in this episode I will be discussing the show In Search Of, which aired a program about D.B. Cooper. Now, this show came out in 1979, but it is available on YouTube for free, and it is hosted by Leonard Nimoy, who was most famous for playing Spock on Star Trek, although he always wanted us to remember that he did other things. Leonard Nimoy actually went on to write a memoir/autobiography called I'm Not Spock, and I would like to give a shout out to Scott, who recommended this for an episode of Black Box Online Radio, and Scott asked me if I had ever watched this program, and I said no, so he recommended it, and as you see, this is one that was suggested by one of the listeners, so if you have any ideas for Cooper Friday or future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, you can put your idea in the comment section down below. You can send larger thanks to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and as always, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. This program, In Search Of, put forward a timeline of the events that happened in the Cooper skyjacking. They said that on November 24th of 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, D.B. Cooper would have arrived at the airport in Portland, Oregon at approximately 2 p.m. By 2:30, he already had his ticket and was ready to board to Seattle on Flight 305. By 2:45, he would have been in line and heading toward his seat, and by 2:50 p.m., on that day, he would have certainly been seated. Now, the flight was supposed to be 36 minutes from Portland to Seattle, but D.B. Cooper commenced the skyjacking. He handed a note to one of the flight attendants stating that he had a bomb, and she put it in her pocket. Didn't think much of it. She thought it was a phone number, maybe an attempt at flirtation, but then he asked her to read the note again. And he opened up the briefcase that he would have been carrying, and he revealed what appeared to have been a bomb, something that was seemingly resembling a bomb, and it was convincing enough for them to take this seriously. So the 36-minute flight ended up being over 2 hours. And on a previous episode of Cooper Friday, I was talking about how I didn't necessarily think that D.B. Cooper was the worst criminal ever. I mean, he may have caused this calamities and these commotions, and he may have done some illegal things, but he definitely wasn't the most evil criminal that I've talked about on Black Box Online Radio. I take it all back. Making a 36-minute flight lasting over 2 hours, that's a terrible thing to do. Absolutely terrible. Shame on you, D.B. Cooper. How could you do that to people? But anyway, the plane lands in Seattle, and at this point, D.B. Cooper is provided with his demands, which were 4 parachutes and $200,000 in cash. Now, this documentary episode, In Search Of, stated that D.B. Cooper took the 4 parachutes and he jumped out with all 4 of them. He had all 4 of them strapped to his body, and he was never seen again. This, I think, is incorrect. After the plane takes off from Seattle, D.B. Cooper only jumped with 2 of the parachutes. And even later on in the episode of In Search Of, they stated that he actually did only jump with 2 of the parachutes. One of them, which is sometimes referred to as the reserve chute, was defective, and it was a ground parachute that had been modified, and the panels would have been sewn shut, so it wouldn't have worked. But this might be somewhat telling about D.B. Cooper and his personality and his identity. It's at this point, though, when people just begin to speculate and theorize and just try to ask the question, who was D.B. Cooper? What could have possibly happened? Because there is this theory out there that D.B. Cooper may have never existed. It's possible that he wasn't even a real person, that this was a story that was created by the crew, by the flight attendants, and by the pilots, and they all just wanted to split the money together, because the authorities who were providing the money to D.B. Cooper weren't on the plane. I mean, a flight attendant exited the plane, collected the $200,000, and brought it back to D.B. Cooper. And if you watch this episode In Search Of, I mean, they just provide yet another example of how this type of conspiracy theory is absolutely false, because there were other passengers on the plane, civilians who were not part of this arrangement among the flight attendants and the pilots this alleged arrangement, and two of them were interviewed for the show In Search Of, and their names were Richard and Barbara Simmons. Richard Simmons, what a name. And they remember very clearly seeing D.B. Cooper on the plane, and Richard even walked past D.B. Cooper and made some type of eye contact with him, although it's quite possible that D.B. Cooper would have had his sunglasses on at that point. And I've interviewed Pat Boland for Cooper Friday, and she states that the man who sat directly across from D.B. Cooper was tracked down, and he even appeared at a Cooper con once. So yes, of course, D.B. Cooper was a real person. This was a real skyjacking. There was a man in the black suit and tie who had the sunglasses and had the briefcase bomb. I think all of these events actually went down, and they actually happened. All right, though. So D.B. Cooper's on the plane, and the back aft staircase is lowered down, and D.B. Cooper orders the crew to all go into the cockpit. And at some point over southern Washington, around the border of Oregon, he jumps out into the night and is never seen again. And they provided several different theories as to how and why D.B. Cooper may have survived the jump, or how and why he may have passed away during the flight. One of the people that was interviewed for the show In Search Of was Earl Cossey, the man who packed the parachutes for D.B. Cooper. And at the time, they introduced him as a man who had 16 years of parachuting experience. Earl Cossey would actually go on to be murdered, and, terrible, terrible tragedy. And I would love to do a full episode on Earl Cossey, just talking about, well, his role in the D.B. Cooper case, as well as this true crime story that is connected to, connected to Cooper, even though it might be a loose connection, but I would still just love to do a full episode on Earl Cossey, rest in peace to him. And he said something that was very similar to the documentary The Skyjacker That Got Away, and that was that if D.B. Cooper jumped out of the plane at night into cloud cover, into inclement weather, then it would have been extremely difficult for him to find the ripcord, because in addition to all of that, he also has to deal with the cold. And then, Earl Cossey is just giving all of these explanations as to how and why jumping at night into those conditions would be difficult. And even if he got the ripcord and pulled the parachute open, he still has to land at night, avoiding all of the obstacles, as well as dealing with a parachute that would not have been very easy to maneuver. And even in this program, In Search Of, they were talking about how the fact that D.B. Cooper chose to go with that one might indicate that he had some type of military experience, some type of paratrooping experience, possibly ex-Vietnam. And I frequently cite the comments of Staff Sergeant Mike Davis, who appeared on Drew Beeson's channel, talking all about how the fact that this guy chose to jump at night is something that does look like he was ex-military, because most skydivers who are recreational or just casual skydivers don't jump at night. They jump during the daytime hours. The military are the guys who jump at night, and I think that makes a whole lot of sense to me, and I completely comprehend that line of thinking. But anyway, D.B. Cooper jumps out at night, and maybe he could have pulled the ripcord open, and then he has to land. Now, they asked a challenge question. Leonard Nimoy is just asking a challenge question to the audience, and you guys know that I cannot resist challenge questions, and that is, how was D.B. Cooper able to know where he was? He's on the plane, and it takes off from Seattle, and at a certain point in time, he's over the border of Oregon, but really he's above southern Washington, and the plane was supposed to be flying toward Reno, but how did D.B. Cooper know where he was? And there are numerous explanations that have been provided, and one of them was, answered in the documentary In Search Of, and they were saying that D.B. Cooper could have used the Merwin Dam, which I've referred to just as the dam in previous episodes of Cooper Friday, and that it had a large array of lights that would have been very recognizable in the expected drop zone. And Bill Rollins has talked a lot about this. He is the guy who's pushing Joe Lakich as a D.B. Cooper suspect. I shouldn't say pushing, he's the guy who has Joe Lakich as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And the Merwin Dam dams up the Lewis River to create Lake Merwin, and this ties all into Bill Rollins' theory about how D.B. Cooper would have landed in or around the Lewis River and used a boat to go to the Columbia River. But there are other explanations that have been provided that I've talked to you guys about on some previous Cooper Friday episodes. And one of them is that he could have jumped out and been looking at the city lights of Portland, Oregon to the south, and the city lights of Vancouver, Washington to the north. And this is discussed in the book Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins. But even last week on Cooper Friday, I was talking to you guys about Chael Sonnen's suspect. Chael Sonnen, the former UFC fighter, has a D.B. Cooper suspect whom he has not named. And even though some people think that Chael Sonnen's whole presentation is just satire, or it's just some type of ruse that he's putting on, there's one thing that I like about it, and that is that he provides an explanation as to how D.B. Cooper could have known where he was. Number one, the plane takes off from Seattle. D.B. Cooper could have estimated the time that he would have spent on the plane, and then jumped out over the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. And the way that he was able to know the location was intense familiarity with the land. Because he had grown up in the area, it was more or less jumping into his exact backyard, his own backyard. And I was even thinking about this if just hypothetically I were to jump out of a plane, with a parachute over my home county in West Virginia, and I didn't necessarily know where I was. I'm jumping into cloud cover or something like that, but I know that I'm above my home county. No matter where I would have landed, it would not have taken too long before I was able to recognize something familiar and know where I was. It's jumping into your own backyard. That might sound like an extreme example, but I know exactly what Chael Sonnen was talking about, and they even brought this up in the documentary In Search Of. The entire fact that D.B. Cooper chose to jump out of the plane over the Pacific Northwest could have demonstrated, well, just that. He had intense familiarity with the land. Now, Chael Sonnen says some other things, like he jumped out of the plane trying to land on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. He would have had a motorcycle stationed there, and he drove from the National Forest to the Yakima Native American Reservation and drove to his home, which would have been about 3 hours away from the drop zone. All right, that stuff is a little bit harder to accept because one of you guys in the comment section said, that's a terrible night for a motorcycle ride. It's a lousy night for a motorcycle ride. I think a motorcycle would have been a very impractical vehicle because you could be saying something to the effect of, well, maybe D.B. Cooper wasn't predicting the weather. Maybe he wasn't looking at the forecast. I think absolutely he was. I think that the skyjacking was meticulously planned based on the way that everything would have been laid out. What? This guy is going to estimate the flight path and anticipate the flight path down to a T, but he's not going to check the weather that night. I don't necessarily think that that's the way things went down. But the episode on Chael Sonnen's suspect was also one that was requested by one of you guys in the audience, one of the listeners to Black Box Online Radio. So thank you so much to all of you who are listening to this program. And if you would like to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. That allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Every Monday I do an episode about the Zodiac Killer, and every Wednesday I do an episode about Jack the Ripper. And for the summer, I'm going live on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Now, as I said, D.B. Cooper jumps at night into the rain. The plane, the Boeing 727 Flight 305, was being followed by Air Force jets. They knew that the skyjacking was in place. D.B. Cooper says that he has a bomb, and the jets are following him, but because it's at night, because of the clouds, because of the inclement weather, they did not see the jump, they did not see a parachute open, they did not see any of this. So this might have worked to D.B. Cooper's advantage. Now, even if D.B. Cooper survived the jump, the inclement weather might also have worked to his advantage, destroying things like any type of footprints or tracks, or anything that could have been left behind to show the exact area where he would have landed. But they also pointed out that even if people are going to try and locate D.B. Cooper from some type of aerial survey, even if they're looking for him in an SR-71 Blackbird, then there would be it's almost just looking for a speck, a white little speck in a giant forest, and that's exactly what it is. It's a needle in a haystack, except it's worse. It's just a giant speck in a white forest, and 50 years later, D.B. Cooper has never been identified. Partnered with what Earl Cossey said, if he got the ripcord open, then Earl Cossey expects that he would have been able to successfully land and that he would have survived the jump. Now, a different person that was featured in this documentary episode In Search of was saying that they thought that D.B. Cooper lowered the aft staircase, and as he made his way down, he was probably just sucked out and lost his grip, his awareness, and he wasn't even able to get the chute open, and he died a cold death. Now, maybe that's what happened. It really is hard to say because D.B. Cooper has not been identified. But there was somebody that was featured in this documentary episode In Search of named Dr. David Hubbard, Dr. David G. Hubbard, and he is someone who became an expert in the psychological profiling of skyjackers, and he actually wrote more than one book on the subject, and I knew that I was going to have to read his books in the future. I was going to have to look at his material, because you guys know that I'm always fascinated by psychological profiling. I am not a psychologist myself, but I just like exploring the material because in some ways, psychological profiling is an educated guess. And even if someone is more educated on the subject than I am, you can often wonder about how and why they're making the decisions that they're making. And firstly, the one of the books that is written by Dr. David G. Hubbard is called The Skyjacker: His Flights of Fantasy. And as I said, perhaps I'll do a larger episode about this on Black Box Online Radio for Cooper Friday. But I was able to pull up a book review that was written shortly after his book came out in 1971 by M.C. Bassioni. And it talks about some similar things that have been shared in the In Search of documentary. When Dr. David Hubbard was on the screen there, he's just saying that he thought that D.B. Cooper was a middle-aged man who did not succeed in life. He was somebody who did this for the money and only for the money. And even Leonard Nimoy was presenting the show and saying that the only conceivable notion was that D.B. Cooper did this for the money. And then Dr. David Hubbard says some very bold claims that go well above just the basic forms of psychological profiling when he's saying that maybe D.B. Cooper's black suit and tie or a server's uniform from a restaurant, or a bartender's uniform. I was just thinking, what? What? I don't know if he meant that literally, or just that maybe he thought that that's what a high-end server would be wearing. It was really kind of hard to know because that's just some very, very precise material. But before I look at this book review from MC Bassioni, I just want to share something about how there is this commonly held belief that D.B. Cooper had to be some type of poor working class guy who committed the skyjacking for the money. And as I told you, there's that quotation from this In Search of show that's the only conceivable thing that he could have wanted, right? I don't accept that at all. No, absolutely not. Do you accept that? Do you accept that the only reason why D.B. Cooper would have done the skyjacking is for the money? I mean, let's look at the other possibilities. Number 1, the thrill. Number 2, the James Bond complex. Number 3, there could have been some type of other malicious activities going on with organizations such as the CIA. I mean, that this could have been some type of psyop. And I invite you to check out my episode on the D.B. Cooper psyop, which you can find here on Black Box Online Radio, if you'd like to hear somebody outlining the theory. And I would also like to invite you to listen to my episode on E. Howard Hunt as a D.B. Cooper suspect, as well as looking at Nat Lou Folk's book, which talks just about this belief that people have that D.B. Cooper had to be some type of low-level working class guy or lower middle class guy. And he's just like, why? Why does it have to be somebody like that? If we haven't identified D.B. Cooper, how can we just say that there was no other motivation or that that's exactly what D.B. Cooper would have been like? And I completely agree. One of the reasons why I wanted to read off this book review here is there's a specific paragraph that has been highlighted by MC Bassioni that is talking about some of the comments from Dr. David G. Hubbard, the expert profiler in skyjackers. And I quote, "The profile which emerges shows these individuals as shy, timid, sexually passive, generally apolitical, and almost always consistent failures in almost every activity in general." And I was like, wow. consistent failures in everything that they have attempted: marriage, sex, business, and social activities. Their appearance is one of helplessness, except for the exhilarating moments when they seize control of the aircraft, then become the only diversion from a previous life pattern wherein they had felt dominated and overpowered by circumstances which guided and determined their hapless and helpless lives. Oh my goodness, some people think that I sound sour and bitter on these episodes of Black Box Online Radio sometimes. What a load of negativity. And this is another thing that I think is just going to be very, very difficult when it comes to these types of psychological profilers. They just have it in their mind that people have to fall into that type of concept. We see this all the time with the episodes on serial killers here on Black Box Online Radio that I do when I'm reading these books about psychology, and they just say, oh yeah, well, a serial killer is somebody who has no friends, he lives a solitary life, he doesn't really go outside a lot, he was abused as a child, he wet the bed, he hurt animals, he set fires. Sometimes that is true, sometimes it is not. Sometimes, that is the exact model of a serial killer, other times it's completely wrong. You will find so many exceptions to the rule. So with skyjackers, why should it be any different? And as it openly says in this book review here that, Dr. David G. Hubbard he studied 20 different cases of skyjacking, and 16 of them really fit that particular mold of being this poor, the hapless and the helpless. You heard all of those negative adjectives. Very, very sour stuff that has been inserted into that type of psychological profile. And I know I said that D.B. Cooper was a terrible person because he made people wait on the plane for an hour and a half more, plus 45 more minutes on the ground once they landed in Seattle. Yeah, that's bad, but at the same time, that is almost just hating on my bro, so to speak, and I just don't really know where's the need for all this type of negativity. But do you have any responses to that type of psychological profile about skyjackers? Now, there is another interesting thing that has been included in here, an observation from Dr. David G. Hubbard, and that is that when there are news events that are related to astronauts, skyjackings are more likely to occur. Specifically, after the news story has broken, when the astronaut has arrived home. And we even see D.B. Cooper happening in 1971. We had the space race. We had landing on the moon in 1969, and this is the stuff that I think is so much more valuable from looking at someone who is an expert. This guy is a psychiatrist who does work with this stuff intensely. This is so much more valuable. And looking at this pattern and behavior that might have happened over the 20 cases of skyjacking that he intentionally studied. So, I know it's not perfect, but not every skyjacker is going to behave that way, but just keeping it in our mindset when there are space shuttle launches and when the astronauts return home, there's more likely to be a skyjacking, which I can only gather it's because somebody is thinking about the thrill of going into space and they want to do something similar. But, you always have to wonder, though, could there be an alternative motive? Could there be something that is outside of the box in this type of thinking? Because one thing that is discussed in this book review from MC Bassioni is a key element in the psychological profiles that have been created by Dr. David G. Hubbard that is removed is political intent and motivation. Well, who's to say that D.B. Cooper didn't have some type of political intent and motivation? I just brought up the CIA and some type of psyop that's going on. How can we say that that's impossible if D.B. Cooper has not been identified? And the fact that that's eliminated and not considered in these psychological profiles, doesn't that just kind of act like a gaping hole in all of this? And as I said, I'm just some kind of amateur guy who's just, reading the books and watching the documentaries like anybody else, but this seems like something that is going overlooked. And why would you not choose to incorporate that? I know what they're going to be thinking, that this is going to be something, that D.B. Cooper's case is unlikely to be politically motivated, but wait a second, it's still possible. Let's study everything. We can definitely see cases of skyjackings that can be politically and religiously motivated. I'm not even going to get into any of the specifics because you guys already know all of these things. But the ultimate conclusion of this book review from MC Bassioni was this is actually one that was written for the DePaul University Law Review. And the ultimate conclusion is that, okay, this is very good at diagnosing the problem. You've got these 20 stories of skyjackings, 16 of them all seem to have these commonalities that are shared, but it's good at recognizing certain problems, identifying the problem, but it's not good at answering the question of, well, what do we do about that? Even somebody who's a layperson, like, how is this information beneficial to the layperson? And ultimately, it all just falls a little bit short there, falls a little bit flat. And I would expect that I would have a very similar experience if I were to read this book in its entirety, Skyjackers, Flights and Fantasy by David G. Hubbard, and I'll probably do that at some point here on Black Box Online Radio. But I thank you to Scott once again for recommending the documentary episode In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, all about D.B. Cooper. And that came out in 1979, even before they found the money at Tina Bar. And, it's just something that's from the past, but it still contained a lot of information. And I definitely want to look at more things like that, because over the years, another thing that can be very fascinating is to look at what elements of the research journey have stayed the same and what elements have been different. And I just brought up the Tina Bar discovery of the money, the $5,800 that were found at Tina Bar. And that would be an example of a discovery that was made in the D.B. Cooper case. But let's just see where all of this goes. All right, that will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned Dahan, and there is BlackboxNed88 on Instagram and TikTok. And I will see you guys on Zodiac Monday. Until next time.